Good afternoon and welcome to today's Schmid Law Library Stir Talk series. On behalf of the Schmid Law Library, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Adam Thimmesch. Just a few quick words about Professor Thimmesch as a way of introduction. He is a graduate with highest distinction from the fine law school one state over, Iowa, where he was an articles editor for their law review. Following law school, he worked for a major international law firm based in Minneapolis, where he worked on a wide variety of issues, primarily business and tax related. Following that, he joined the University of Nebraska College of Law faculty in 2012. Here he teaches issues of tax, state tax, business tax, those sort of issues. He quickly became a very prominent, maybe too early in his career to say prominent, but has excelled in his teaching. In 2013, he was voted Teacher of the Year by the upperclass students, and in 2014, he won Excellence in Teaching Award, so he's been excelling at that. In his scholarship, he's also been able to get a number of articles published in tax and business areas. In today's talk, he's going to talk about tax non-compliance and the internet sales tax. So if you don't want to know about why you should be paying taxes on your Amazon purchases, leave now.
That is an accurate disclaimer. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you for showing up today. What I'm going to present on today is a project that really combines two areas of particular interest to me. The first being the question of why people comply with the law, why people comply with tax laws more specifically, or why they don't comply with tax laws. And the second being this issue of the internet sales tax, or something you might have heard referred to as the Amazon tax, things like that. To set this up, at the forefront, the first thing to recognize is that U.S. taxpayers are generally very compliant with their tax obligations. Worldwide, we're recognized as being a highly compliant population. We largely pay over what is owed. But of course, that's not universally true. There are certain types of income, certain types of taxpayers, certain types of businesses for which compliance is much lower than we would otherwise want. And one of the things that the IRS does is to run estimates on the so-called tax gap, the difference between the taxes that are actually owed under current law and the taxes that are ultimately remitted. And we can look at the taxes that are ultimately paid at court, or taxes that are ultimately claimed. If you look at the former, sort of what we actually collect, and the difference between that and what's owed, we get a tax gap here that's a huge load of cash. So the IRS's most recent estimate of the tax gap at the federal level is $400 billion every year. So there's a $400 billion gap between the amount of taxes that are owed and the amount of taxes that are ultimately collected. Now that's obviously a big deal, and a lot of people have made their careers looking into why that is the case. Worked by economists, psychologists, sociologists, obviously tax law scholars in the U.S., worldwide, etc. What I'm doing in this project is not taking on the entirety of that research. What I'm doing is looking more specifically at this particular issue of the state use tax gap. And we'll talk in a minute about what the use tax gap actually is. But what you can see immediately is that the number is a lot smaller, right? We're talking about $20 billion. Economists' sort of closest estimate is that this tax gap for all the states combined is a $20 billion a year issue. So that's like 5%. So up front, right, you start to say, well, this looks like less of an issue. If you want to put it in more context, though, there's been a lot of talk recently in the popular press about corporate inversions and companies like Burger King trying to move offshore or become foreign companies in order to avoid U.S. taxes. That hit the press, became very sort of prominent. Congress got on this, the president was on this, everybody was talking about this. The estimate that the government has put on corporate inversions, luckily for purposes of my talk and my research, is also $20 billion. Over 10 years, though. So the corporate inversion issue is a $20 billion issue over the next decade. The state use tax gap costs states $20 billion every single year. This is a big issue for states, state finances, and the services that states can provide to their residents. All right, so what is the use tax gap? A little bit of background on what this actually is, because a lot of people may not have even heard of the use tax, much less know what it actually is. So use taxes work in concert with the state sales tax. They work in the same way. So here, Lincoln, Nebraska, we've got a 7% sales tax. We also have a 7% use tax. And these apply to the exact same items. They apply in the exact same rate. So a sales tax you're all very familiar with. You go into Target and buy whatever it is. We'll talk about TVs today, why not? You buy a TV, you pay a 7% sales tax. Technically, there's also another taxable event when you then use your TV, the use tax. The way that the taxes work, though, is they work together. So if you pay the 7% sales tax, the 7% use tax goes away and you never have to worry about it. You never think about it. And that's why many of us may not have ever even heard of this tax. The opposite, though, is also true. And this is where we start to generate this $20 billion of gap. If I do not pay the 7% sales tax, I do pay the 7% use tax. This is a surprise to many. Now, the situation where this most often comes up today is this, right? We go online, and one of the things that we all like about going on Amazon or Etsy or wherever it happens to be, I'm not personally a big Etsy user, but I appreciate that others are. One of the things that we like about doing that, or that sort of maybe pushes us to do that, is that they're not collecting that sales tax. So one of the questions that scholars have addressed is why that's the case and whether it should be the case. And where this goes back to is an old 1967 Supreme Court decision, not involving Amazon, incidentally enough, but involving catalog orders. So this goes right back to mail order sellers. So back in 1967, states witnessed the same sort of thing. People appreciated that if they purchased from people outside of the state, they could avoid that sales tax. And states complained. They went to they passed these statutes saying, well, we don't care that you're out northeast, right? We're sitting here in North Dakota, Illinois. We want you to collect our sales tax. Vendors challenged that under the Dormant Commerce Clause, and the Supreme Court agreed and said, look, under the Dormant Commerce Clause, the state simply does not have the power to require you to collect their tax. You are sitting out in wherever it happens to be, Massachusetts, West Virginia, wherever it is, you have nothing to do with these states other than that you send your goods into the state. So under the Dormant Commerce Clause, the Supreme Court has prohibited states from requiring these retailers to collect their sales tax. This is why you see the difference between buying a TV at Best Buy or maybe on bestbuy.com or Target's website and Amazon. Best Buy and Target have physical locations in the state, therefore the state has authority. Amazon does not. Amazon does not purposely, because it knows of this rule. The state does not have authority to require Amazon to collect the tax, and incidentally, it doesn't choose to do so of its own volition. Now, the dirty secret that you all now know is that just because they're not collecting that sales tax doesn't mean that consumers get off scot-free. Consumers technically still owe that use tax because they're not paying the sales tax. Of course, virtually nobody actually pays it. And this is where it gets interesting for somebody looking into tax compliance. One of the reasons that people may not pay this tax is that people simply don't know about it. But even among people who pay, and I might out some of my colleagues, maybe even some of my other tax colleagues I've talked to around the country, even people who know about this tax are turning away from it and choosing not to comply. Now, there are a variety of reasons that this might be the case, and that's been the subject of very little scholarship. compared to the question of whether states should actually be allowed to go after these folks. So what you may see is something like the Marketplace Fairness Act being discussed, and you may have heard that in the popular press. It's a bill that states have backed, trying to get Congress to go in and override that physical presence rule using its affirmative Commerce Clause power. So what states have done is to look at the federal government and say, let's get rid of the physical presence rule. What states have not done is largely looked to individuals. Instead, we get something like this. This is the basic state approach to use tax compliance. The states are basically putting out their hand, putting out a hat, and saying, if you want to pay this, that would be fantastic. But we're not going to do much more than that. Under this sort of system, we get the results that we've gotten, right? We have a $20 billion use tax gap. That's of interest to me because of what it says about tax compliance. I started the talk, I recognize exactly 9 minutes ago, I'm keeping track of my 15, by saying that Americans are largely highly compliant with their tax obligations. So what I'm doing is looking at why we have this disconnect. Why is there such a disconnect between the general motivation and the general attitude of American taxpayers that they comply and this situation where they don't? And what I found is that very few people have even considered the question. The traditional narrative, if people even mention it, is to say, well, we've got this situation, right? We've got a situation where states are simply holding out their hand. They're not actually auditing people. They're not penalizing people. Why aren't they doing that? Well, each one of us owes, what, $75, $100, maybe $200. You can do the math, right? It's a 7% tax rate. If you buy $1,000 worth of goods online, that's $70 of tax. It doesn't make economic sense for the state to send out an auditor, look at your bank statements, look at your credit card statements, sift through all of that, and then send you a bill for $100. Most people have relied upon that and that alone to say, look, we're not going to be able to obtain meaningful levels of compliance. One of the biggest tax compliance scholars and economists down at Tulane has called this tax virtually unenforceable. I'm challenging that a little bit. What I'm doing in my work is taking a look and asking whether that's actually right. And what I've identified is that this sort of theory relies upon this sort of cartoonish figure of tax compliance. Really old school cops and robbers, what you might hear is deterrence theory. And under the deterrence theory of compliance, we say people decide whether they're going to comply with the law or not by doing some sort of calculated cost-benefit analysis. You know, am I faster than, you're probably faster than this cartoon cop, right? If there's a 90% chance that I'm going to get away and keep the proceeds, right, versus a 10% chance of getting caught and maybe having a little bit of a penalty, which one's better? Which one has more utility to me, right? And if you look at it in this cops and robbers type situation, it's obvious why nobody pays use tax, right? There's nobody chasing you. It's just you taking the cash and running away. So if we just apply deterrence theory, I absolutely agree. We are not ever going to achieve meaningful levels of individual compliance, and we have to go this federal route. Fortunately for me, fortunately for us, fortunately for states, scholars have identified a significant number of other models of tax compliance, and some of them are just listed here. And so what I'm doing in this project is to sort of capture all of the research, or as much as I can, about these different models of tax compliance. Look at the most recent studies, look what we know about these models, and propose that we actually apply these to help promote compliance with this largely unenforceable tax. So we have the deterrence theory. There are social norm theories, right? Why do people, all stop at the stop signs, et cetera? There are no police officers waiting around. Well, maybe it's that there's a social norm of compliance. We comply with the law because we're part of a community, and our community members comply with the law, and we want to be a member of the community, and we value being respected. And so social norm theories would suggest that you would comply with a tax when you feel that other people are actually complying. So it goes beyond just simple cost-benefit analysis. There are theories based upon your feelings regarding the legitimacy of the government's authority. So if you feel that the governmental authority is legitimate, or that its power is legitimate, The theory is that you are more apt to comply regardless of whether you want to or not, regardless of whether you agree with what you're being asked to do. So there are a number of factors that scholars have identified that go into your feelings regarding the legitimacy of authority. One of those is trust, and that's a big factor of what some of our law psych folks are doing. If you trust the government authority, if you feel that the governmental authority trusts you, scholars have shown that you're more likely to comply. So something as simple as in communications with taxpayers, instead of saying you failed to pay tax, pay up, you're a cheat, saying there must have been a mistake here, right? We trust that you tried to do the right thing. Let's talk about this. Simple changes in tone of communication have been shown to increase compliance. So trust as a model of tax compliance. Matters of procedural justice. Procedural justice would suggest that it's not the outcome of your interaction with the state authority, not the fact that you have to pay tax that matters, but how you were treated. Were you given an opportunity to speak, to be heard? Do you feel that the government actually listened, that an impartial person listened to your appeal? Those issues, those procedural matters, build into your feelings about the legitimacy of authority and then have an impact on your willingness to comply. Retributive justice, I'm not going to go through all these in great detail, but you can see there's a number of these theories. So retributive justice basically says, I'm not going to be the only one complying. I'm not going to be the fool. And I say this, I am the fool complying. I am one of the whatever 1% complying because I feel strongly about this and because I'm on videotape talking about this, right? Let's not be silly. But retributive justice would say, look, I'm going to comply as long as you're willing to slap the wrist of the people who are not complying. And if you're not going to do that, don't make me the fool who's paying this on my own. So in situations where you don't feel that there's being that fairness, where there's not retributive justice, your compliance will fail. Finally, I'm way too low to talk about behavioral economics, but it's fantastic. In the last 10 seconds, my ultimate goal here is to say that we can apply these models of tax compliance to not only increase state use tax collections, but we can use the lessons that we learned from doing so to help inform us about these models, what works, what doesn't work, and what we can ultimately use to help us solve that $400 billion tax gap federally and tax gaps worldwide. Thank you.